I used to work as a church official in London. It's interesting that over the almost 7-year period, as I travelled around parishes, met catechists, met people who were being catechized, one of the things that became increasingly clear was that, look, I understand that when you're at a Catholic conference and so on, the general expectation is for you to be very optimistic about everything. I'm not very good at that, so I'm just going to tell you how I saw the situation. When it comes to faith induction and faith retention, it's a catastrophe out there. It's a really, really terrible situation. And increasingly, I wanted to know why this was the case, and I think I started to get to the bottom of it to some degree. Since then, I've been working as an editor for a journal and writing articles, and all from home in Bedfordshire. And this has meant that I've been able to spend a lot of time with my wife and children, and I've been able to spend a lot of time out in the countryside, doing a lot of hunting, sometimes for quarry, sometimes for mushrooms, and I haven't killed myself yet from picking mushrooms, which is very easy to do. Which is quite interesting because there are two forms of hunting there, and in the former, the risk is really for the animal. In the latter, the risk is really for you. So we don't tend to think of foraging for mushrooms as such a lethal activity, but it really is. And wandering around in fields has given me the time to reflect a lot on this, and particularly to try and understand the kind of epistemological assumptions that are at play when people try to catechize and when people try to evangelize. And so I think you have to go right back. You have to go all the way back to some of the most basic questions when it comes to the practice of our religion. And it seems to me, reflecting on my experience as a church official, that we are getting, the way that we talk about the faith, we're getting that wrong. When I've spoken to people to transpose political terminology into the church, which we all do, and we do it because it makes sense, when I speak to people on the more conservative end of the spectrum, they want to emphasize the assent to the articles of the faith. They want to emphasize the robust propositions that we assent to, and we assent to it, they insist, because they are rational and reasonable, and it's rational for us to do this, and we are the heavyweight in the ring. We have a robust, strong intellectual tradition, and Catholicism is the smart guy's option. And so when it comes to catechizing people, what we really need to do is make sure that the principles of the faith are conveyed. I've heard even some people in the traditionalist movement in the church, with which I have, as many people know, for which I have a lot of sympathy, say, we can pretty much solve the whole post-conciliar rupture by just going back to the seminary manuals of the 1950s, for example. And then I speak to people on, let's say, the more liberal end of the spectrum, and I hear people talking about that faith is a journey, that we're all on a journey. And yes, it's true I've got this chaotic situation in my moral life, and yes, it's true that I don't really believe in the real presence, or I don't really believe, in I don't know, this or that doctrine, but that's okay because I'm on a journey. Now, this also seems to me to be deeply problematic, particularly because Scripture's pretty clear that God cares about the details. Moses didn't see the promised land because he tapped a rock twice. I mean, that should indicate that, the details matter, right, when it comes to our relationship with God. But they're also both right. They're both wrong and they're both right. So notice that there's a fundamental word when it comes to our religion, the revealed religion. There's a fundamental word which I haven't said yet, but should be right at the center of every conversation regarding the Catholic religion. And that word is grace. And this is something that we don't really feel comfortable with now. We don't really understand what the term denotes. It's interesting, my friend Joseph Shaw, who is the chairman of the Latin Master Society, and also the chair or the president of Una Voce International. Before you couldn't be both at the same time, but they've amended the Constitution. So now Joseph Shaw has this kind of traditionalist empire over which he's saying the division of powers are over, I'm afraid. And he did a study on the fundamental changes between the old liturgy and the new liturgy, the post-conciliar liturgy. And he wanted to see where the fundamental discrepancies were. And he also studied it historically, what was omitted at what point. And interestingly enough, Bunini and his commission, one of the first things that they did when they were revising the liturgy was they took out nearly all the references to grace. Very interesting. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is just because there was this malign plot going on, though I think there may have been. But I also think that what we're dealing with at a deeper level are some fundamental intellectual commitments that don't correspond very well to the deposit of the faith that are making their way into the public life of the church. So let's go back to what we mean by the faith and why grace is important for understanding this. Well, to those who say Catholicism is a rational assent, I actually heard, I won't say who, but somebody who is called upon very regularly to speak on behalf of the Catholic Church to the BBC and various media outlets, actually say everything about my faith stems from reason. Everything about my faith stems from reason. Well, okay, in some way, if you want to say that God is uttermost reason because he is the perfect act of intellect, then fine. But I don't think that that's what this person meant, and I also think that that's not what this person's listeners hear. So the first thing to say about the propositions of the faith to which we assent is that they are not of themselves plausible. And this is quite obvious when you think about it. It is certainly plausible that God exists. Prior to the revelation in Jesus Christ, prior to the revelation to the Israelites, people believed that God exists. exists. Many communities believe that God exists. Aquinas argues that whilst the knowledge of God's existence is something that can be concluded to by reason, more likely than not, whatever you conceive that to be will be a phantom of the imagination, will be a creature, but it doesn't mean that it can't be known by reason. In fact, what the church teaches is that the existence of God is not among the articles of faith. The articles of faith presuppose the existence of God. Okay. So what is it that we're actually assenting to when we assent to the Catholic faith? Well, you can kind of go through them and think, if I were to meet a reasonable, intelligent, well-formed, cultured person who just happened to have absolutely no familiarity with the Catholic religion at all, and I started explaining what the content of the Catholic religion, you could forgive that person for not being convinced. Right? If you were to say, God exists, the person says, yes, I know God exists, I believe God exists. And you say, yeah, but he also incarnated. Okay, what was that like? Well, he became a carpenter in an obscure place of Palestine 2,000 years ago, and then he was crucified as a criminal. But then he came back to life and ascended into heaven. The person might say, I think that's an interesting story, but I don't think that that happened. Now, you might say in response to that, well, actually, every major town in this country has a building in which he resides, and you can go and he's really there. He's really present there. The person might say, okay, great, let's go there and let's talk to him about this. Well, he looks like bread. Well, does the bread talk? No, the bread doesn't talk, it's just like bread. Then the person might say, okay, I'm sorry, I just don't find this plausible. Okay. Now, you might then want to do a bit of work on the scriptures and say, okay, but look how the Old Testament testifies to the coming of this person and so on. And the person might say, that's interesting, some of this seems to fit, but like many well-meaning Jews do today, may think that those parts of the Old Testament simply testify to something else. And I would not blame them. So what's actually going on? Because perfectly reasonable and rational and intelligent people do assent to the Catholic faith. So do they do it in violation of their intellects? Well, I don't think we want to say that either. So what is actually going on here? Well, what Aquinas says is that God enters by created means into the human heart, into the depths of the soul, in a way that is analogous, he says, to language, right? I can convey my very self by speaking to you, but my language is an emanation. It's something that, if you like, is analogous to creation. I'm creating it as I speak. And by created means, God enters into the depths of the soul, and Aquinas says he establishes a sympathy between the creature, the human being, and himself. A co-naturality. Another way to put this is he establishes something like a friendship. So that when faith comes by hearing, when one of the ministers of the church tells you the content of the faith, instead of saying, that's not plausible, when somebody announces to you the good news, God has incarnated. Jesus Christ, the second person of the triune Godhead, came, sacrificed himself, and has bridged the void between you and God. You say, yeah, that does sound like God. That's interesting. Well, why are you saying that? Well, it's because through prevenient grace and then coming to fruition through sanctifying grace through the sacraments, God is in some way bringing you into his perspective on the world. Okay. Now, this is extremely, I think, difficult for us to understand, this role of grace, because it's fundamentally existential. It's part of a story. It's something that goes on throughout our lives as we grow in friendship with him. And this is difficult for us to understand today because modernity is characterized by the privileging of technical knowledge. So, and this is often complained about by humanities people like myself in universities, where universities seem to privilege the STEM disciplines, those disciplines that give you the principles so that you can be useful, so that you can be of use. The humane disciplines, like philosophy and theology and history and literature and so on, you can't do a lot with those. They can do a lot with you, but you can't do a lot with them. And this is very difficult for us to understand in the modern world, because we look at things from the perspective of utility, we look at things from the perspective of use, and we prioritize those principles that we can give to people so that they can be of use. And this, of course, has flowed over, unfortunately, into how we understand didactic enterprises within the church, which takes me back to my original point. In the at one end, we're talking about the catechetical principles. And people are just endlessly churning out new catechetical programs, as if another catechetical program is going to solve the problem. You know, every 6 months we get a new set of DVDs from some kind of slick American telling us, you know, this is another way of presenting the same stuff, and it's not solving the problem of a complete deficit in faith induction and faith retention. And then, because we've emptied the faith of its entire existential character, we then try and compensate for that with these ridiculous, highly emotive, I don't want to give examples because I don't want to offend anyone too much. But you know, maybe you will imagine what I have in mind. You know, we organise these events where you have somebody on a guitar strumming away, sort of repeatedly saying, Jesus, we love you, or something, and then the Eucharist is presented and everyone can sit there and emote for hours, and this is meant to compensate for the fact that we've emptied our religion of its entire existential character. And that doesn't work either. It's like trying to make up for the absence of a real long-term sacrificial bond with a one-night stand. It doesn't work. It's a bit of a crude analogy, but you know what I mean. And of course, now increasingly there is a view that we have to make the liturgical experience catechetical. By the way, this is not a novel idea. The Protestants did this a long time ago. They decided that liturgy was primarily a didactic experience where you went to hear preaching. And now we think that this is going to solve the problem. More technical knowledge, more principles, more instruction, that's going to solve the problem. And what we're seeing is an absence of the devotional life. Most people don't know the content of the devotional life. We don't instruct people in the devotional life. It was amazing when our bishops kindly locked down all of the churches before the government even asked them to do so. And people started saying, well, you'll have to do spiritual communions from home. Well, no one had ever heard that term. Alphonsus Liguori thought that one of the first things you should teach people is how to make a spiritual communion. Not just because you couldn't get to Mass, it's something that you could do throughout the day. But we hadn't been taught these devotions, so no one knew what they were supposed to do with themselves. But that's primarily what the faith is. It's very interesting that in Mass Exodus, the book by Stephen Boulevant, there are two very impressive sections in which he does a study on these communities that have fared better in the post-conciliar decades, where faith retention has been better than other places. And what he finds is that often in these places, the catechesis was substandard. But the devotional life was very high. There are, for example, in some of the coal mining communities in the north of England and in the Midlands, there was a village that had a priest who used to expose the sacrament on a Sunday night. And so these guys who had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go and work in a mine and work in pretty awful conditions, really serious hard labour, would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and in order to fill their slot to do Eucharistic adoration in the night. And the children saw, this wasn't, they didn't think that their father, for example, was necessarily well versed in complex theological arguments, but what they saw was serious devotion in the family and a serious acts of sacrifice. And so their children grew up into adults who practiced the faith. God, when he reveals himself in history, does not give us technical principles. I heard someone say, and to be fair, they said it humbly and in a spirit of genuine inquiry, but I heard somebody say, it's not clear to me, now we have the 1994 Catechism, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's not clear to me why we need the Gospels. I've got the principles, I got it now, I got the stuff, I got the manual, right? I can work the machine, right? As long as I just get to Mass occasionally and oil it, the machine will keep working. But Christ doesn't give us a manual. God, when he reveals himself, he gives us a saga. He gives us a story. Our religion is not a system or an abstract argument, a sophisticated case. It's the story of God transforming by grace the tragedy of the fall of creation and the death of man and turning this entire catastrophe into a glorious wedding feast. That's the story that God gives us. It's not a set of abstract propositions. And this is very difficult for us to understand increasingly, not only because of the privileging of technical knowledge, but because we don't really understand stories anymore. Our own stories are broken. Our families are broken. Our friendships are conducted virtually. The stories of our nations are broken. And the entire providential vision that was completely, if like me, you are a bit odd and spend long periods of time reading pre-revolutionary, 17th century literature, you realize that actually the providential vision of history was the shared vision of our civilization, down to the man working in the field. In fact, we don't tend to read literature anymore, unless it's to read something that's either hypersexual or hyperviolent, which is simply to titillate our appetitive impulses either way, but it's not to join a story. And this is especially terrible for men, and the reason it's especially terrible for men is because it's stories that teach us about authority. We who are given authority, say when we start a family, are confused. It becomes a burden because we don't know how to have authority. And authority, on the whole, gives people the heebie-jeebies. They think of authority as something dictatorial, as something threatening, and so on. And even though we are increasingly living in a very authoritarian and very totalitarian society, in which authority is generally not wielded for the good of those who are subject to it, it's constantly covered up in the terms of egalitarianism, precisely because people are conscious of just how much authority scares people. But we learn about authority not from abstract principles, but by attending to those who have authority and have it well. My wife and I have been making our way through the Arthurian tales. And what's very interesting about Arthur is that he has incredible authority, and everyone wants to subject themselves to his authority. But he never, ever says that he has authority. And you never hear Arthur say, "You must listen to me, I'm in charge here," or any of this stuff. It's almost that the more one insists that they have authority, the weaker it must be. But we only learn this from stories, not by abstractly speculating about authority. I don't know how many of you are Tolkienians here, but some of you might recall, it's not in the films, it's in the book, when Aragorn comes to reclaim the White City and take the throne of Gondor. And the remaining son of the steward of Gondor, Faramir, he's my favourite character. I think he's an amazing character. He's in the city, and whilst he must, by justice, hand the throne over to Aragorn, because it's not even in his gift, Aragorn refuses to enter the city. He sets up his tent outside the city, and he waits for Faramir to come to him and invite him inside. This is because Aragorn does not conflate authority and power. It's very interesting. One of the things that I've noticed over the years of my marriage is that between my wife and I seem to have the authority. And it's very interesting that when my wife needs to enforce something and comes up against resistance from the children, she refers to me, and then the children do what they're told. And yet, I don't seem to be wielding the power. I would just like to stay in my study, right? I don't really want to get involved in whatever's going on down there. My wife is wielding the power in the household most of the time, and I just seem to be this kind of lurking, malign presence that makes things happen. All right. Now, it seems to me that because following the Enlightenment and all the catastrophes of our civilization that have led to the prioritizing of technical knowledge and our tendency to live in abstractions, it seems to me that more than ever today, we need to recover religion by experience, a lived religion. God as providential Lord, not in some abstract sense that, yes, as perfect, non-contingent being and the ultimate act of existence, whose essence is his existence, blah, 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 on which the world depends at every given moment, and he is the ultimate explanation for the world's existence because he unites the created contingent essences to their particular acts of existence through his own intentionality, etc., etc. In that sense, he must be providential. I don't mean that. I mean that at every given moment, your life is wrapped up with his story of making himself present in creation and taking you from subjects of the satanic principality of the fallen world into adopted children of Christ's kingdom. That is what I'm actually talking about. That is the providential vision of the world. And this is so important for us men in particular, because that's really our role, right? Another thing that I drew from my experience working for a diocese, when I went to parishes, I would often ask people, what are the laity for? What's the apostolate of the laity? What's our mission? And no one seemed to know. And whilst they didn't say it, because it's not fashionable, they all gave various descriptions that largely amounted to pray, to obey, and to pay. But that's not really the mission of the laity. The mission of the laity is to go into the temporal domain, the world of business and family life and politics, to go into the temporal domain, which legally belongs to Satan. If you don't believe me, read the first 3 chapters of The City of God, St. Augustine, the founder of Latin theology. He's actually more authoritative than me. And he is quite clear about this. The world of the family, of the city, of the political life, of business, of trade, all legally belongs to Satan. And our job is to go into it and place it under the kingship of Christ. That's the job of the laity. It's not the job of the clerical hierarchy. The job of the clerical hierarchy is to sanctify us so we can do that. This is a deeply this is a battle, right? This is a deeply existential experience. This is something that does not lend itself to abstract speculation. It lends itself to the heroic saga of throwing yourself into the battlefield. Now, it's interesting because one way that after the so-called Enlightenment, when we switched all the lights off, that we tried to re-concretize the world is through this massive explosion of trying to find ways of recreation. The Enlightenment, particularly the following Romantic movement, was really the movement of hobbies in many ways, right? You can look up the Wikipedia page on Romantic chess, which is quite an interesting read. And this was particularly so in England. In the 1940s, George Orwell commented on the fact that actually the English are basically exclusively characterized by our commitment to hobbies. We all just have endless hobbies. And this is an attempt at reconcretizing our life, getting involved in real activities. And it's certainly better than what they ended up doing on the continent, which is just sitting around in the square drinking espressos and scoffing at people walking past. Unless you're a lady and then you do it from the window in the in the second floor. But it hasn't really worked. And what's interesting is that we embrace certain hobbies as counterfeit pilgrimages. Right? This is the origins of hiking. Right? In the Protestant world, in central Germany, for example, the more Catholic elements of that, and of course in Bavaria, which is Catholic, you get this whole idea of the wanderlust, right? The love or desire of wandering. You get this need for some kind of counterfeit pilgrimage where you can throw yourself and you can make a sacrifice and you can sweat and you can ache and you can throw yourself into the world, put yourself at risk, and what will come out of that is this kind of amazement at the world, and hopefully that will lead to an amazement of God's presence in the world. That was certainly, the thought of Friedrich Caspar and his paintings, his romantic paintings. The famous one, The Wanderer, which better translates as the hiker, right? Going on these, and Friedrich Caspar was very influenced by this idea that you can re-evangelize the world by encountering God in nature, and in this country, the Jesuit priest Father Thomas West, he basically invented hiking. He wrote a book about how to walk around the Lake District in the late 18th century, and he set up all these hill stations and so on. So you can tell your friends, walking was invented by the Jesuits. But none of this has worked, and in a sense, they're all making what is essentially the primary error of the conciliar enterprise of the 20th century, which is to try to get nature to compensate for a loss of supernature. And it doesn't work. It didn't work in the temporal arena, it didn't work at the level of culture, and it hasn't worked in the church. In fact, it's led to the largest apostasy in the church's history. And it is this attempt, because we are embarrassed by supernature, because in the end, once you talk about supernature, you're going to have to talk about grace, and then you're going to have to start talking about the implausibility of the articles of faith, and you're going to have to start talking about the fact that actually our faith really rests on love of God, not on any sophisticated argument that will convince a university professor. That's what you're going to have to end up saying, and it's embarrassing. It means that you're a fool for God instead of somebody very clever who can compete in the satanic arena. I'm afraid that's the problem. So, because we're embarrassed by supernature, we're desperately trying to get nature to compensate for the loss of it, and it's not working. And of course now hobbies have died out. People don't have hobbies anymore. People don't join associations anymore. Clubs are always struggling to recruit people. Hobbies are dying out, and it's being replaced by computer games and virtual engagement. And so we are trying a last ridiculous, pathetic attempt to redeem the world by the means of nature, by fleeing the world and recreating a new world altogether, a completely virtual one in which we can live. And in fact, the head of Facebook has proposed literally doing that. Meta is what he's called it. And meta is a word that is important in philosophy, but it's also important in Scripture, because it is Hebrew for to die. So, that's what he's promising you. And we're moving towards the rise of a world population of technologized zombies. And these men are not going to make good dads and good husbands. This is an incredibly infantilizing revolution that's going on. So, that's all depressing. What I used to do is I used to say all of that stuff, and then I used to say, thank you very much. And I used to walk off. And then then my teacher, when I was doing my doctorate, said, try to offer a solution at the end instead of just leaving everyone to go and find a whiskey and a revolver. So, fortunately for me, the title, I think, offers something of a solution. I've already suggested that in the church, one thing we could do is perhaps think a little bit less about these catechetical principles, not because they're not important, but because they are secondary. We could certainly have a serious think about whether there are obvious advantages to the way we're compensating for the deficit in an existential religion. So what we could do is start prioritizing the devotional again. If Stephen Bullivant is right, then we need to take that very seriously. Now, it seems to me that the act of pilgrimage is a kind of crowning event in devotional life. It also enables one, in what is becoming an increasingly soft world, to experience sacrifice. Sacrifice for the pagans meant the taking of an animal or a human being and killing it and offering it to an idol in order to expiate for the sins and evils of oneself and the community. That's what sacrifice used to mean. Human sacrifice was pretty much universal. The only place where human sacrifice was not part of the religious culture was among the Israelites. Now, it's a bit controversial to say this, but I don't think we can really get round it. The reason why the Israelites did not offer human sacrifice is because they were put to one side by God to offer the one human sacrifice that would end all sacrifices. So, that's what sacrifice used to mean, but that's not how we use sacrifice in our culture, because we're downstream from a Christian culture. How we use it is, I'll sacrifice my time for this person, or I'll make this little sacrifice for this person. Why is it that sacrifice has changed so radically in its meaning in this way? It's not an equivocation on the word sacrifice. It really is the origins of the way that we use sacrifice in this way, as colloquialism, is because of the Christian theology of sacrifice. When you deny yourself, you unite yourself to the ultimate self-denial of Christ on the cross, and therefore your suffering can truly be redemptive in the world. You really are making up what is lacking in the sacrifice of Christ through uniting yourself to his sacrifice. That's a quotation from Paul. I'm not saying anything blasphemous. If I am, he said it first. So that is the That is what pilgrimage gives you an opportunity to do. The amazing thing about pilgrimage, for anyone who's taken an extended pilgrimage, I, quite a long time ago now, walked to Loreto, for example, with which this place is obviously associated. When you go on a pilgrimage, you don't really make things happen. It's like life. Your job is just to walk, and that's pretty much all that's expected of you. What happens on pilgrimage is things happen to you. On pilgrimage, your technical principles and your technical understanding and your abstract sophisticated arguments for your religion suddenly fade away into the background because you find yourself completely reliant on the providential Lord of the here and now. You rediscover what it is to have a lived, existential, real religion, experienced. And what's amazing about that is when we talk about freedom today, we tend to think about freedom as freedom from things. We tend to think about freedom in purely negative terms. But if you read, again, pre-Enlightenment works, particularly philosophical works, it's not how they talk about freedom. They think of freedom primarily as something positive. Freedom is about being free for things, free to do certain things, free to be the person you're supposed to be. And what is interesting about pilgrimage is that your options are so limited. You've got one trail, you've got one destination, and you can either keep walking or give up, but those are really your options. You're not free from anything. You're confined, and yet you find that your freedom is enormous. You find that you have finally been liberated to give yourself wholly to God and not be focused on anything but Him. You recover the concreteness of your religion. And what is, I suppose, the most important thing about pilgrimage is that it's to a specific place in the world. A concrete place in the world. Again, the rationalist error that was so embraced by our Protestant brethren, that actually the church and salvation and holiness are invisible things. They're invisible things. Is completely blown out of the water by this idea that no, we are going to a holy place in the world, and our job as laity is to expand the territory of holy places into the world. You know, when our Lord says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, what we tend to think is that you've got this rock, and you've got this fort built on it, called the church, and it's being constantly attacked, but don't worry, I've promised you that they won't be successful. But think about what Christ says. The gates of hell will not prevail. Gates don't move. It's not that the principality of Satan is coming up against the walls of the church. It's that Christ has established this new legal jurisdiction called the kingdom of Christ. And you can become subjects of him and citizens of that territory by the mechanism of baptism. And once you have joined that kingdom, you are an enemy of the principality of Satan, the prince of this world. That's why, when you get baptized, you have to publicly denounce him. So I'm no longer part of his principality. I don't belong to that anymore. I've opted for the kingdom of Christ. And now your job, as part of the royal vanguard of Jesus Christ, is to wage war against the principality of Satan and expand the kingdom of Christ. And the gates of hell are not going to be able to withstand that onslaught from the church. That's what Christ is actually saying. And we tend to flip it round, unfortunately. And we lose its meaning. Now I will stop. So I'll take any questions, and that's all I want to say. All right. Thank you. There's about 5 minutes or something for questions.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay. Great. Hi.
I'm Phil McCarthy. Can I just make, am I right?
Just
make a comment. I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much. And I particularly liked the way that you talked about the practical spirit, the practical benefits of pilgrimage in a very concrete way. You know, accepting a destination, but also accepting there are a variety of routes to that destination, but you must choose one.
Yeah.
And you must try and find the best route. And I think there's very great parallels to in our life. I really like the stuff that you said about the vulnerability of being on the road, the fact that you experience yourself as a contingent person on the environment, the weather, but also on the goodness of other people and their welcome and hospitality for you. But I think that for me, one of the really important things that pilgrimage can do for you is to turn loneliness into solitude, because it allows you to make that transition, which I think is a profoundly important one, about becoming an adult, an adult person, male or female.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we ought to be thinking about. It's encounter with people we don't normally meet, but it's also about that change from being a lonely, isolated individual into being a person who enjoys solitude and flourishes in solitude.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Can I pass this to someone else?
Just a question. I mean, about kind of an anti-intellectual church, okay? Because I think that's definitely been one of the problems that we've kind of had, certainly in my lifetime. You know, growing up in the sort of 70s and 80s, I would say we've definitely had, and probably still do have, an anti-intellectual church. So, how do we avoid the risk by prioritizing devotion, for example, of becoming kind of anti-intellectual?
Well, it's a good question. My view happens to be that we don't have an anti-intellectual church. And I'll explain what I mean by that. We have lots of intellectuals in the church. And we have lots of intellectuals who are competing in universities. The problem is, many, not all obviously, but many are deeply embarrassed by our own intellectual tradition. So they are competing in secular universities, and they are experts in all of the same stuff as their colleagues, but they are largely embarrassed by our own intellectual tradition, which is why, we have in this country 4 Catholic universities. But are they Catholic? I mean, to some degree they are, but it's not really obvious how and in what sense they are Catholic. They want to compete with their secular equivalents, and so they teach the same subjects. And for example, in the philosophy department in St. Mary's University, Twickenham, I don't think there's a single Catholic, and they certainly don't know anything about the Catholic philosophical tradition at all. They're almost exclusively formed in the utilitarian and materialist tradition. So we have Catholic institutions, we have intellectual bodies, we have intellectuals. You and I went to a conference where we met the foremost expert in the world on the ethics of drone strikes, and he was a Jesuit priest, right? So that's what he's done with his ministry. We have these intellectuals, but trying to get an institution set up with the patronage of the bishops in pretty much any country, I mean, you can just about do it in the US, although it's jolly difficult, trying to get any institution established that is actually going to form people in the Catholic intellectual tradition, in which study and intellectual inquiry is a species of the devotional life, that is almost impossible. Almost impossible. The great liberal arts colleges in the United States, like Thomas More College and Thomas Aquinas College and Christendom, are all private institutions run by the laity without the patronage of the bishops. There are some seminaries, for example, in the United States that will offer courses to the laity, but on the whole, we are thoroughly embarrassed by our own intellectual tradition, which is a category of the devotional life. That's the important point here. So I don't think the problem is an anti-intellectual church. The problem is that we are patronizing the perversion of our own intellects. Yeah.
Okay, just a quick comment on that, actually. Colin Smith, your talk reminded me of C.S. Lewis's Men Without Chests, and in a sense, the opposite to the intellect is the guts, but the chest is not the emotion. It's those devotional, affective practices which apply also to virtues and the moral life. So it's a reminder we need that. What does he call a sort of liaison officer between the intellectual and the sort of emotive, and I think that's something that's quite absent from a lot of modernity. People seem to go one way or the other, but we need to recreate that bridge, which I think is what you're speaking to. Then pilgrimage is an excellent example of that.
Well, thank you. It is. It's interesting that we primarily associate the spiritual life with the intellect. You'll find that in many manuals and so on. But really, what the human person is revealed in the scriptural concept of the heart. Right? It's out of the heart that comes what a man is. It is, and this is the big difference between the preaching of Christ and the teaching of Socrates, for example. Socrates thinks that what makes you bad is error in your intellect. Yeah? And he thinks that badness in human beings is always corresponds to ignorance. Okay? Which is interesting, because for Socrates, you can never really be culpable. Christ doesn't think that at all. Christ thinks that the badness in you comes from the fact that you are bad. Socrates is extremely patient with bad people, with people that he thinks are leading people astray and saying bad things and corrupting the youth and so forth. And he is very patient with them, and he goes through the arguments and he does his Socratic method in order to try and bring them to a state in which they accept that they've concluded erroneously, or that they don't really know what they're talking about. Christ says, "You hypocrites, you vipers, you whitewashed tombs." Right? Now, that's not because Christ doesn't possess the patience of Socrates. That's because Christ knows what the human heart is and understands what culpability is. Okay? And so the revelation of the person, which the Greeks were getting wrong in this way, comes through the scriptural concept of the heart. There's an amazing book on this called Persons, the Difference Between Someone and Something, by the German philosopher Robert Spemann, in which he traces this. And of course, what's very interesting is that the person isn't the mind, not the soul, not the body, not even the conglomerate of all of those. The person denotes the relation that exists between human beings in which we call each other to account and in which we praise or judge one another. And it is the moral relation that exists between us. And the scriptural term for that is the heart. And that's why when we move from the age of external law to the law of the heart, Ezekiel tells us what God is actually doing is he's just removing a heart of stone and placing there a heart of flesh, so that the emergence of the person can take place. And this goes back to your point earlier, that pilgrimage, for example, provides the setting in which you can be vulnerable to another person, depend on another person, be called to account, be called to gratitude, that you can emerge as a person in interpersonal relatedness. And the opportunities for that in our virtual world, in which our relationships take place through the mediation of machines, is becoming more and more diminished. So that's something to reflect on anyway. Do we have Sam?
Yes.
What do you think is there are a couple more questions. Should we continue?
Yeah.
Sorry, just
Break,
go
breaks
in.
around 11. Just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks, Sebastian. Great talk, thank you. You said pray, obey, pay. It would seem to me that if that's what the laity are doing, that's the wrong term. Have we lost touch with contemplative practices, the idea of theosis, deification in our lives to transform the world? How can we, if you think that would be a solution, something we can work on in our lives, what's the best way, do you think, to bring that into our lives so we can go out and sanctify the world?
Well, pilgrimage is a good start. But, okay, I'll give a historical example. So, you're probably working out now that in my general historiography, I think that everything bad happened in two events, the Garden of Eden and 1789. That's my general kind of view of history. One of the things that the Enlightenment and the rise of laicite in France and so on did is it severed the temporal and spiritual powers. And it made the temporal arena the secular arena. So the temporal arena was no longer the lay division of the church, but a secular arena, independent of the church, which was not to be sanctified, and the clerical hierarchy were not to try and sanctify the members of the temporal arena. That's what you got. You got this sharp division. Now, what was heaven's response to this rupture in our civilization? Heaven's response was perilemonial. Our Lord appeared and he revealed his heart, and he said that that there was going to be a hardening of hearts that was going to create this secular world. In the Augustinian terms, it was going to take a division of the kingdom of Christ and place it back under the legal jurisdiction of Satan. And the way to get out of this was to transform the human heart by grace, by making it a likeness of his heart. And so he said, you need to consecrate the nation, the temporal arena, to my Sacred Heart, and you need to place an image of my Sacred Heart in every family home. And if we can do that, we can restart the process of theosis. Because the laity are called to sanctification, are called to transformation in Christ, but not in the same way as the consecrated religious, and not in the same way as the clerical hierarchy. We are called to be transformed in Christ so as to transform our sphere of agency, the temporal arena, into the likeness of his kingdom. That's what we're supposed to do. That's why the Sacred Heart tradition and the tradition of Christ the King have always been interrelated. They've always been connected with one another. In fact, they weren't separated until the institution of the Feast of Christ the King in 1925. And if you read Pope Leo XIII's prayer to the Sacred Heart, every single stanza of that prayer begins with, "You are King, O Christ." Right? These devotions were completely connected with one another. To me, it is very sad that the post-conciliar laity have lost the devotion of the Sacred Heart, which really was a kind of devotion of the laity. It was the devotion of the family home, the enthronement of the Sacred Heart in the family home, where you would gather for the Rosary, for example. It really was heaven's last hurrah at trying to bring the laity into the kingdom of Christ, and it was heaven's last great attempt at Christendom. And through a succession of events, we just betrayed him over and over and over again. And the way that you can at least atone for that in some small way is by enthroning his image in your home. And pray before it every day, and say your daily rosary, and get up and say your prayers in the morning, and say your prayers in the evening, and say graces before meals, and don't be embarrassed by this great big image of the Sacred Heart in your house when your secular friends come over or your family come over. You know, these are all ways in which you are undergoing the process of theosis. We sometimes have romantic images of mysticism, of transformation in Christ, and we think that it entails, levitating and looking sort of wistfully up into the corner of a room or whatever. You know, we tend to have these romantic images, but mysticism is really nothing more than rediscovering your life as part of the story of God transforming the world so as to redeem it and ultimately unite it with heaven at the wedding feast of the Lamb. And it's the whole the journey of mysticism is your life celebration that you're one of the wedding guests. That's what it really is. And what the Sacred Heart tradition does is it gives you an avenue into a lifetime's contemplation of what the heart of the bridegroom looks like. So I'm a big, as you can tell, big advocate of the Sacred Heart. Maybe if our overlords ever let us travel, your next pilgrimage could be to Perilimonial. So there we are. There was.
Sorry, it's a bit of a basic question, but it's something you said got me thinking. You said intellectual devotions. Can you just define succinctly what is a devotion as opposed to another religious practice, say? Well, what actually is devotionalism? Well, some would say going to Mass is a devotion. In a sense it is, as I understand it. but it's also an obligation. It's a bit more
Yeah,
complicated.
yeah.
What is a devotion, and how we define it to encompass everything? Obviously, a pilgrimage is one type, but you said there were intellectual devotions as well. I guess Lectio Divina maybe, or something. What is devotion?
Well, so there's a long tradition in the Dominican order of talking about study as a devotion, right? Because you can study to be clever, right? Which is a fairly base motivation. Or you can study so as to know the glories of God, so as to give your life to Him better, right? These are two completely different attitudinal stances toward the intellectual life. But to give the broadest possible definition of devotions, I would say the devotional life is doing holy stuff. Okay, so you have. I always find it a little bit weird when people say things like, "I have a devotion to the Eucharist." So that's weird to say that, but in a way they're kind of right, in as much as if you're saying my relationship with God is nurtured and fostered by going to adoration and going to Mass and making visits to the tabernacle and making spiritual communions when I'm out on a walk and I kneel down in a field and I give glory to creation and I want to unite myself to the Eucharist wherever it is nearest, 10 miles away or whatever. If that's what you're saying, then yeah, you have a devotion to the Eucharist in that sense.
So it's basically stuff you do for the purpose of sanctity and to draw closer to God.
Yeah, my worry is that Catholicism is increasingly becoming an internet genre. And by becoming an internet genre, it is becoming an interesting conglomerate of abstractions. But that's not what lived religion is, and that's not what the process of sanctification is. If you want to do Catholicism, fill your life with doing holy stuff. That's really the point I'm trying to make.
I liked your point about Protestantism making things invisible. One of my friends is an evangelical, and she said, I asked her, what do you do to pray? And she looked at me as if I'd asked her the most bizarre question. What do you mean, do stuff? Like, I meant, well, what do you say to God? She didn't understand you can actually pray psalms, you can actually use images, it's just alienism. I don't actually understand what she does.
Right.
She just kind of sits there and, I don't know, thinks of how saved she is. It's very, very peculiar. And I think the lack of devotionalism, it is a massive problem in the Catholic Church. We're teaching confirmation classes. They don't know how to do anything. As far as they're concerned, you come to Mass, go home, I guess that's it. That's the story of Christianity for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very serious. Yeah.
Luca, you keep putting your hand up. No? All right.
So, Alex.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for unpacking all of that in a very short space of time. I just kind of maybe wanted to get more into has it been men, priests, women, like who's actually got right with doing this?
In these communities that are analysed in Mass Exodus, it's dads. It's dads, and this is the big problem that we have today. That and Piero, you might talk about this at some point because I know this is something that has concerned you in the past. That the parish. The parish has this catechetical team. The priest has very little time with those who are being catechized. That's generally subcontracted to a catechetical team who don't themselves really know what they're doing. And most of them, according to in my experience, have not been successful when it comes to faith induction and retention in their own families, but this is now subcontracted by both parents and the priest to these people who I think don't have the credibility or the credentials for this. The parents think that the obligation has been taken off their hands because it's in the hands of the parish. The school does not believe that it has a catechetical role or a role in the mission of the church because they think that that element has been subcontracted to the parish. And so everyone in this group thinks that the other person is doing the job, and none of them really know what the job is. Right? The parish catechetical team, one, they're probably going to do a bad job, and even if they do an excellent job, they don't have enough time with your kids, one, to catechize them, and two, more importantly, to instill in them the ongoing habit of devotion. The priest certainly doesn't have that time, right? Most families, their exposure to liturgical life is 1 hour a week, okay? And that cannot compete with the television or the football club or the computer games or any of that kind of stuff. If you look at Boulevant's report, if you look at the famous Swiss study on faith retention and faith induction in Christian denominations, everything indicates that if the mother takes up the baton and is serious about faith induction and retention in her family, she will not be successful. It's not popular to say this, but the statistics are there. I have been publicly criticised as a misogynist for pointing out these statistics. I didn't do the study. The Swiss government did the study. The Swiss government is not known for misogyny. These are simply statistics, right? The mother will not be successful. Okay, it's in the 5%, something like that. Okay. The only way that we are going to reverse the trajectory that we are on is if dads take their role as head of the domestic church seriously. The jury is in, the statistics are there, right? And the great thing is that you guys don't need to have masters in theology in order to do that. You just need to say grace before meals and say a rosary in the evening. That's it. You got that down and you're going to be all right. The statistics are there. Okay? So that is, I think that's a good message to end on, probably.